The paramedics told me later that I was unconscious for about 4 minutes. 4 minutes where my heart was doing whatever it wanted and my brain had decided to take a vacation. I don't remember the ambulance. I don't remember the emergency room doors. The first thing I remember is a ceiling with fluorescent lights and a nurse with a kind face asking me if I knew what day it was. I did not know what day it was. What I did know, once the fog started lifting, was that my son was standing at the foot of my bed with his arms crossed, looking at his phone. He didn't look up when I said his name. He just said, "You gave us quite a scare, Dad," in the same tone you'd use to tell someone they'd been late to a meeting. I'd had a mild stroke. That's what the doctor explained to me about an hour later. A transient ischemic attack, technically, though he said they wanted to keep me for observation because of my age and my blood pressure history. I was 64. I'd been retired for 8 months. I had a golden retriever named Biscuit, a vegetable garden I was genuinely proud of, and a pension from 31 years working as a civil engineer for the city of Edmonton. I was not, by any reasonable measure, a man whose life was in crisis. And yet there I was, lying in a hospital bed at the University of Alberta Hospital, watching my son check his texts. His name is Nathan. He's 36. His wife, my daughter-in-law, is a woman named Priya, who I've always genuinely liked. Smart, warm, the kind of person who remembers what you said 3 conversations ago. They have 2 kids I adore, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5. And for a long time I told myself that whatever friction existed between Nathan and me was just the natural tension of a father and son who are too similar. I stopped believing that about 2 years before the stroke. It started when he lost his job at the logistics company where he'd worked for 6 years. That was fine, things happen. And I wasn't unsympathetic. I gave him money to cover 3 months of mortgage payments while he looked for something new. He found a new position within 2 months, but never mentioned paying me back, so I let it go. It was $3,800. I told myself it was a gift. Then there was the car. He'd had a fender bender, and his insurance premiums went up, and he asked if I could co-sign a loan for a newer vehicle, because his credit had taken a hit. I co-signed. The payments came out of his account automatically, and that part was fine. But when I needed a small favor in return, just help moving some furniture out of my basement, nothing major, he was busy for 4 weekends in a row. I noticed. I didn't say anything. The pattern continued. A loan for a home renovation that never quite got paid back in full. A request to borrow my truck for a week that turned into 6 weeks. Calls that went unanswered for days, then returned with half attention. When he did come to visit, he spent most of the time on his phone or talking to my granddaughter, just enough to look present. And every few months there'd be a new ask. Always framed carefully. Always with a reason that made sense on the surface. Always with the unspoken assumption that I would say yes because I was Dad, and Dad had the pension, and Dad had sold the property in Sylvan Lake 2 years earlier, and done quite well on it. He wasn't wrong about that last part. I had done well. The cabin I'd bought in 1997 for $112,000 had sold in the fall market for just over $420,000. After capital gains and fees, I walked away with a number that made me feel, for a brief moment, genuinely secure in a way I hadn't felt since my wife passed. My wife, Dorothy, died in 2021 from pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in March and gone by October. 7 months. That's all we had from the moment the doctor said the words, to the moment I was standing in the funeral home on 101st Avenue, trying to pick out a casket by myself because Nathan had said Priya was sick and couldn't travel, and he didn't want to bring the kids to something like that. He sent flowers. I'm not telling you this to make you hate my son. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that by the time I ended up in that hospital bed, I had already done a great deal of quiet accounting. I had been patient. I had been generous. I had given him every benefit of the doubt a father can give before the doubt starts to outweigh the benefit. He stayed at the hospital for about 2 hours that first evening. He told me he'd had to rearrange his whole day to come, which may or may not have been true. He told me I should eat better and exercise more and manage my stress, which was the kind of advice that is technically correct and emotionally tone-deaf in equal measure. He told me to call him if anything changed. Then he left. He didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. On my third day in hospital, I was moved from the acute care ward to a regular room, which the nurse, a woman named Helen, who had the energy of someone who had heard every possible version of every human story and was still genuinely interested in yours, told me was a good sign. I was stable. The neurologist was pleased with how the imaging looked. I'd need some medication adjustments and a follow-up in 6 weeks, but the prognosis was good. Your son called the nurse's station this morning, Helen told me, setting down a cup of tea I hadn't asked for but was grateful for. What did he say? He asked how long you'd likely be here. She paused just a half-second too long, and whether the attending physician had assessed your cognitive function. I looked at her. She gave me a small, careful smile. I thought you should know. I lay there for a long time after she left, watching the afternoon light move across the ceiling tiles. The question about cognitive function sat in my chest like a stone. It wasn't concern. I knew what concern sounded like. I'd heard it from Dorothy's sister, who called every day during those hospital weeks and cried on the phone even when she tried not to. This wasn't concern. This was reconnaissance. He was checking to see if I was still capable of managing my own affairs. My financial affairs, specifically. I thought about the conversation we'd had in August, about 3 months before the stroke. He'd come for dinner, one of his increasingly rare visits, and somewhere between the main course and dessert he'd started talking about real estate investment trusts, and how much better my Sylvan Lake money could be working for me. He had a friend, he said, who managed a small private fund. Very solid track record. He could make an introduction. I said I'd think about it. He brought it up again in September. Then in October, the week before the stroke, he called and said his friend was closing the fund to new investors at the end of the month, and if I was interested, it would have to be soon. He'd need me to move the capital quickly. The minimum investment was $250,000. I told him I'd think about it. On day 4 in hospital, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my lawyer, a man named Gerald, who had handled my affairs for over 20 years and who had drafted Dorothy's estate documents and my own will. I told him what had happened, what Nathan had asked about in terms of my cognitive assessment, and what had been discussed regarding the investment fund. Gerald was quiet for a moment and then said in his mild Edmonton way, "Raymond, I think we should have a meeting when you're out." I told him I thought we should have a meeting before I was out. He came to the hospital the following morning with a folder and a portable notary setup, which I hadn't known was a thing but was apparently something he'd done before for clients in similar situations. We talked for nearly 2 hours. By the end of the conversation, I had updated my will, restructured the beneficiary designations on my RRSP and my TFSA, established a formal power of attorney with Dorothy's sister, my sister-in-law Margaret, who lived in Saskatoon and who I trusted completely, and signed a letter to my bank authorizing a freeze on any large transfers pending a 72-hour review period. Gerald also explained something to me that I had not known, that under Alberta's Adult Guardianship and Trusteeship Act, an adult child cannot simply petition to manage a parent's finances on the basis of age or health alone. There is a process. It requires medical evidence of incapacity. It is not easy, and it is not quick. And it does not happen while the parent is sitting in a hospital bed having perfectly coherent conversations with their lawyer. I was not incapacitated. I was annoyed. On day 5, Helen stopped by during her shift and asked how I was doing. "Better," I said. "I have a project." She laughed at that. I was discharged on day 6 with a prescription adjustment, a follow-up appointment card, and a handshake from the neurologist who told me to take it easy for a few weeks and consider a stress reduction practice of some kind. I told him I gardened. He said that counted. Margaret drove down from Saskatoon to bring me home. She is 68, still sharp as anything, and she had known Dorothy since they were 7 years old. She stayed with me for 4 days, stocked my refrigerator, walked Biscuit twice a day, and sat with me in the evenings without needing to fill the silence with anything in particular. She is one of the best people I have ever known. Nathan called on the day I got home. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and Margaret was out with the dog when the phone rang. "Dad, I heard you were discharged. That's great news." "It is," I said. "How are you feeling?" "Good. Better." There was a pause. "Listen, I've been thinking. Once you're feeling more yourself, we should probably sit down and talk about some things. Practical things. About your situation going forward." My situation, I said. Just planning. You know, making sure everything is organized, given everything that happened. I said, that sounds fine, Nathan. Come for dinner on Saturday. He came on Saturday. Priya didn't come. She was at her mother's, he said, with the kids. He arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine, he set on the counter and barely touched, and he sat across from me at the kitchen table with the careful energy of someone who has rehearsed something. We talked for a while about nothing, the weather, the Oilers season, his son's hockey schedule. I let him find his own way to the point. Eventually he did. He said he'd been doing some thinking about my financial situation, and he was concerned that I didn't have anyone actively managing things, that the money from the Sylvan Lake sale was just sitting in a savings account earning almost nothing, that his friend's fund was still technically available because they'd made an exception for him specifically, and that if I wanted to move forward, I would need to act in the next few weeks. I listened to the whole thing. Then I said, Nathan, I met with Gerald last week. He blinked. Your lawyer? He came to the hospital. We made some changes. I kept my voice even. The Sylvan Lake money has been moved into a managed portfolio through my bank's wealth management division. Margaret is my power of attorney now. The will has been updated. He was very still. The investment you mentioned. I'm not going to be doing that. I looked into it. The fund isn't registered with the Alberta Securities Commission. That's not something I'm willing to overlook. The color in his face did something complicated. I also want to say something to you, and I want you to hear it as something I'm saying because I love you and not because I'm angry. I folded my hands on the table. I was in the hospital for 6 days. You came once for 2 hours. You called the nurses' station to ask about my cognitive function. And the first conversation you've initiated since I got home is about moving $250,000. He started to say something. I held up my hand. I'm not finished. I took a breath. I don't think you're a bad person. I think somewhere along the way you started seeing me more as a resource than as a father. And I don't know exactly when that happened or whose fault it is, but I know it's true. And I'm telling you that it stops here. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, I could hear Biscuit moving around in the backyard. The money I gave you over the past few years, the mortgage payments, the co-sign, the renovation loan, I'm not asking for any of it back. Consider it settled. But I'm also not a source of capital for private investment funds, and I'm not going to be managed or maneuvered, and I'm not interested in having my competency questioned while I'm lying in a hospital bed. Nathan looked at the table. His jaw was tight. What I am interested in, I said, is being your father. If that's something you want. I'd like to come to my grandson's hockey games. I'd like Priya and the kids to come for dinner more than twice a year. I'd like you to call me sometimes just because you're thinking of me. I paused. That's what I have left to offer. I'm not sure it's what you came here for, but it's what I've got. He didn't say much after that. He left before 8. He didn't take the wine. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after his car pulled out of the driveway, and I won't pretend it didn't hurt. It hurt in the specific way that things hurt, when you have been hoping for a long time that you were wrong about something, and you finally have to accept that you weren't. But underneath the hurt there was something else. Something that felt, if I'm being honest, a lot like clarity. 3 days later, I got a text from Priya. It said, Raymond, I heard about your conversation with Nathan. I don't know everything that's happened between you two, but I want you to know that the kids miss you and so do I. Would you want to come for Sunday dinner next week? I read it twice. Then I texted back. I'd like that very much. I'll bring something for the kids. She sent back a small heart. Nathan was quieter at that dinner than I'd ever seen him. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't warm either. He passed the potatoes and asked if my follow-up appointment had gone well, and answered when spoken to. It was a start, or it was something that might become a start. I wasn't sure yet. What I was sure of was this. I had spent 36 years being Nathan's father. I had coached his soccer team and driven him to university in a rented van, and stood in a hospital waiting room while Priya was in labor, and cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. I had buried his mother I had loved him in ways I was never particularly good at expressing, in the quiet Canadian way of men of my generation, who show up and fix things and don't say the word love very often, but mean it every single day. I was not done loving him, I was just done financing him. Gerald called the following week to check in. He asked how things were going in his careful way. Settling, I said. Good. And the power of attorney documentation is all filed. Margaret has copies. Your bank has copies. Everything is in order. Thank you, Gerald. Raymond, he said, and I could hear him choosing his words. You did the right thing. I've seen what happens when people don't do what you did. It rarely ends well. I thanked him and hung up and went out to the backyard. Biscuit was lying in the last of the November sun, his chin on his paws, watching me with the total patient faith that dogs have. The garden was done for the year, everything mulched and put to bed. The sky over Edmonton was that particular pewter grey that means winter is coming for real. I sat down in the cold on the back steps and Biscuit put his head in my lap and I scratched behind his ears for a long time. I don't know what Nathan will become. I don't know if the conversation we had cracked something open in him or just hardened it. I hope for the former. I have been hoping for the former for a long time. What I know is that I have 6 weeks until my follow-up appointment. And a neurologist who says I'm doing well, and a sister-in-law who loves me, and a granddaughter who called me last Tuesday just to tell me about a book she was reading at school and wanted to know if I'd ever read it. I had not. She's lending me her copy. That's enough. For now, that is more than enough. There's a moment in the hospital, somewhere around the second night alone, when you stop waiting for the door to open. You stop listening for footsteps in the hall that sound like someone you know. I remember that moment clearly. It wasn't dramatic. It was just quiet. And then it was done. And I understood something I had been refusing to understand for a long time. What I understood was this: the choices I had made over many years to give without asking, to forgive without naming what had happened, to keep the peace at the cost of the truth, had not protected my relationship with Nathan. They had slowly hollowed it out. Not because generosity is wrong, but because generosity without honesty isn't really generosity. It's avoidance dressed up as kindness. And avoidance over enough time teaches the other person exactly the wrong things. Nathan didn't become who he was in that hospital room. He became who he was over years of small lessons I had taught him without meaning to. Every loan I gave without follow-up said, money doesn't need to be taken seriously between us. Every time I let a slight pass without saying anything said, you can treat me this way and nothing will change. I'm not saying this to be hard on myself. I'm saying it because it's true, and because the truth of it matters. What I did in that hospital, calling Gerald, thinking clearly about what needed to be protected, refusing to be managed, none of that came from anger. It came from something closer to self-respect. The kind of self-respect that takes a long time to locate when you spent years being the person who smoothed things over. But it was there. It had always been there. I just had to be still enough and alone enough to find it again. Gerald came to me because I asked him to. Margaret held power of attorney because I chose someone I trusted. The bank restrictions were put in place because I thought carefully about what was actually happening. None of it was revenge. All of it was clarity, and clarity, I've come to believe, is one of the most decent things you can offer yourself and the people around you, because it gives everyone a chance to deal in reality instead of comfortable fictions. Nathan has a long road. I don't know where it goes, but the conversation we had at the kitchen table was the first honest one we'd had in years, and there was something in it, underneath the discomfort, underneath his silence, that felt like the beginning of something real. Whether he does anything with that is his work to do, not mine. What is mine is this: the garden, the dog, my granddaughter's borrowed book sitting on the nightstand, a follow-up appointment I'm not afraid of, a life that is genuinely mine, with the accounts in order and the doors open to the people who walk through them for the right reasons. That's what it looks like when you finally decide your own life is worth looking after.